Great, thanks very much. I'll wait for the signal to get the program started because I think we're going to go on sharply at 2 p.m. Is that correct?
Who's in charge?
I'm going to go with 2 p.m. So whether a red light comes on or not, we're starting at 2 p.m. So hold tight for a moment or two. I'll get us started. I'll wait for a signal that we're ready to get going live. But audience members, thanks very much for choosing this session. We're excited to have you here today. Thanks for choosing this one among others. There's a lot of good presentations taking place today. It's my understanding that in this room, I believe the entire length of the conference, when there's not a keynote session, you can come here and find a featured presentation on leadership. And I believe those leadership sessions are being live streamed in the same spot. So come back often, visit this session. You'll hear and learn quite a bit about leadership. If we're good to go live now, welcome everyone. Herndon. It's my honor as Vice Chancellor of Workforce Development in the Community College System Office in Richmond, and it's great to be with this panel today. I'm going to introduce them momentarily. This session on leadership is one that features selections from the Chancellor's reading list, and so you're going to hear from our distinguished panelists momentarily on their experience and their work and their selection of leadership material. And so as I introduce them, I know these gentlemen, and I've known them for a number of years, the Chancellor, in fact, for a portion of his 16 years as Chancellor. But I thought in preparing for today, I'd do a little research, and I turned to what I always turn to, which is Google. And so I learned that John Downey is, according to Google, a CIA operative who was held in captivity in China for 20 years and then released to become a Supreme Court justice in Connecticut. Congratulations, Dr. Downey. Also present. I outed John Downey. You heard it here first. John Downey also serves as president of Blue Ridge Community College. Ted Raspiller is a college dropout who became a president of community college, according to what I read at his alma mater. That is true. He also is a 19-year-old finisher of the P.F. Chang's half marathon in Arizona, where he had a time of 1 hour, 19 minutes, which is a 6:03 per mile pace. Congratulations, wow. Dr. Ted Raspiller.
I'm watching you, buddy. I'm watching you.
Well, the next gentleman, you should watch the man next to you, because not only is he a Shakespearean actor, a public television enthusiast and champion of their programming, he also passed a series of bad checks in Williamsburg, Virginia, was arrested, and I'm not sure how, but he's supposed to be doing time right now. So it's great to have him out of prison and with us for a little bit of time. I promise you, each of those Google entries is true. They may not be true of the gentlemen who are here with us today, but they are straight from the files of Google. So, gentlemen, thank you very, very much for being with us today. We're excited to have you here for this session. As a reminder, the books that are featured in today's presentation are available at the Follett, I think, book department here on site, so check them out if you're interested in some materials you've learned. But I'm going to start off with, I think, an easy question for the folks in this panel. Of the leadership books you've chosen and have been recommended from the Chancellor's professional reading list, why did you choose the book you selected, and what makes it worthy and meaningful for the folks in this audience? Chancellor, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So I was coming here. I've been to this conference for 16 years, and as some of you know, I spent my first 10 years as a community college teacher, so I dressed as a teacher. Come on, guys, what's up? So why did I choose these two books? So generally, even though I've been in leadership positions in a number of different states, I do not read leadership books. I typically find that many of those authors are very good observers of leaders, but they really haven't run or really have made a lot of the key decisions that leaders often have to make. But I do like to read biographies of those who have been in leadership positions. I'm particularly interested in political biographies, biographies of folks who have done extraordinarily well in the business community. Like, if you ever want to read an extraordinary one, Carnegie arrived here with a penny in his pocket. He said, "I'm going to be the wealthiest man in the world before I die," and he accomplished that. But before he died, he wanted to give it all away, and he couldn't accomplish that because he had just so much money. And I also like to read some biographies in military, but primarily I like the political arena and in the private sector. So I picked the two books I chose, one a biography on Washington, and another a biography on Theodore Roosevelt. some people call him Teddy Roosevelt, but you would have never called that to, you would have never referred to Teddy to his face. It was Theodore or Colonel. But on Washington, what fascinates me about Washington is, you know, kind of chance favors the prepared mind. Or, I mean, Washington wouldn't be anybody if it weren't for that small little conflict we had with England. If it weren't for England, there would be no Washington. So here's an opportunity, a chance where he steps up. And if you look at most people like Washington in history who lead a nation, no, lead a rogue colony to nationhood, and everybody said he was the guy. They point themselves as some kind of a dictator or a king. And then when they're about to die, they make sure, if you look at history, that their son, in some cases daughters, but their family continues the bloodline of being the ruler. And Washington walked away from that when he could have said, I want to be king. And went back to his farm. And that is so unusual for somebody that could say, he could have done anything and gotten anything. And he said, no, I'm going back to my farm. And I hadn't been there for many, many years. And then he was called back because the country, the way we originally configured ourselves, it wasn't working. It was a confederation of states. And in 1781, in the summer in Philadelphia, these guys, they came back with the idea that we need to tweak this new country. And they didn't tweak it, they fundamentally redesigned it. And now they needed a president. And they called Washington to become president. He became president, and then after 8 years, there's no rule. He could have been president until the day he died. And after 8 years, he said, it's time for me to put this down and go back home. So here's an interesting life, known all around the world by the time, way before he died, that he walked away from power and authority 2 times. You can't find that in history that much. Now, real quickly on Theodore Roosevelt, what cracks me up there about this guy, he was born in a fairly well-off family in New York City. His idol was, his hero was his father. And his father was a great man, known in philanthropy circles in New York City. But Theodore was his own person. And he was a sickly little kid. And his father said, you know, he had suffered from asthma to the extent that his parents thought that he could die at any one of these attacks. And his father said, you know, you have such a sickly body. And he did. He was a scrawny little kid. He said, you have to build yourself a stronger body. And he set up the whole top of his house into a big gymnasium. But he was so focused, some would say, I would say, obsessed. When he caught on to something, he was going to take it to the extreme. And one of the biggest disappointments to his family that he did was he entered into politics, which was not what a high class family in New York City. You just didn't do that and get involved with all those Irish people, you know. And he did, and he rose so fast. He was the youngest Speaker of the House in New York State Assembly. To this day, that's still the case. But what fascinates me about him, and he had some real bad habits. Most famous people do. What fascinated me about him on the positive side was, you know, if many of us listened to those that are close to us, we probably wouldn't have accomplished a lot of what we have accomplished. He didn't listen to them. He stayed focused on what he wanted to achieve. From, you know, hell or high water, he was going to achieve that. He had some deficits. You know, he was I mean, can you imagine he was newlywed. He was the Speaker of the House, and he gets a call that his wife, who is living with his mother in New York City, is very, very ill, about to have a baby. And he gets in a train, and he gets to New York City, and that night, his wife dies. And on the same night, his mother dies. Pretty unbearable. And the way that he coped, I mean, this is not a healthy coping mechanism. He just took off. He took off to the wild west, which in those days was North Dakota, where he just tried to lick his wounds and became a rancher. And his daughter name was Alice, and she was raised not by him in the early years. And when he became president, and I'll end with this because I'm taking too much time, when he became president, Alice was also kind of like her father. She wasn't afraid to do things like smoke in public, which was not a cool thing to do in 1908. And then,
Full circle on that one.
and then one time, a great story. Someone says to President Roosevelt now, you know, how can you control your daughter? She once described Calvin Coolidge as the guy that looks like he's on top of the wedding cake, publicly. So that was later in life. But when Theodore was asked, how can you control your daughter? His answer was classic. He said, I'm the President of the United States. I can run the country or I can control my daughter. I can't do both. Fascinating life.
Thank you, Chancellor. Not only was that a leadership lesson, that was a parenting lesson, so thank you.
There you go.
Also touched on some two important things I want to mention. That was seizing opportunity when it exists and realizing that it has a lifetime, that it's not infinite, that opportunity exists for a certain period of time. You also pointed out the importance of focus and persistence, bordering on obsession, but being very close not to teeter across that line. Dr. Raspiller, same question. What's original about the book you studied? Tell us about it. What is it distinguishes it from others that you've read on the topic, and what would you point out to this group?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Glenn that a lot of the books that you read on leadership talk about theory, talk about things that are derived from observing others and not necessarily rolling up your sleeves and doing it. And as many of you know, I taught at ODU, and leadership was one of the courses, and I've read a whole lot of leadership theory books and thought a lot about leadership. And one thing that I think about leadership is if a person is a good leader in this context, if they can run a community college or they can run a department in a community college. Could they run a department in a hospital? Could they run a department in an insurance agency? Are leadership skills transferable? We talk about management skills a lot, and those are transferable. I understand that there's contexts where we're more comfortable and more experienced, but I think a lot about the transferability of leadership skills. Nobody had it like Robert E. Lee. And so that's probably one of my first fascinations. Now, I grew up in Chicago suburbs, so what we learned about the Civil War was two things, Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. So not knowing a lot about what happened on the other side of things, I got interested in that, and that's what kind of got me in this little fascination with Robert E. Lee. And I think, though, when you think about Robert E. Lee, here's a guy that had took his family's agricultural business that was quickly dying on the vine, pun intended, and turned that around, jumped into this leadership role, dragged into this leadership role in the Civil War. He had a military background, as did his father. His father was kind of thought of as a ne'er-do-well. His mother was the one that came from the Blue Bloods. But anyway, so he got a hold of that in a leadership role, and you hear arguments all the time. If he would have been on the other side, would they have won, all this and that. But then he took off and did what, right? Took control of a college here that we used to know as Washington. Now it bears his name as well, and turned that one around. So that's, I think, probably the initial thing that attracted me was listening to or reading about him and his thoughts about leadership, but also these consequent authors. The other thing, and evidently I don't look like one, but I consider myself a teacher, and at the end of each chapter, this book, it's a nice tool because it kind of draws out those most salient points about leadership. And I think as a reader, it gets you thinking not so much about Robert E. Lee and what he was dealing with at that time, but how transferable those traits and skills that he had are into today's context.
Thank you, Ted. Dr. Downey.
Same question. I'll start out by saying that presidents normally aren't competitive, but I do have the thickest book up here. And just want to think that's very telling.
Yeah, it's telling, all right.
I was lucky enough to see the original Broadway cast of the musical Hamilton, and it inspired me, and I came back and read this book. And it's an amazing story because I think in a lot of ways it's a community college story, in the sense that, Ann Holton at lunch talked about the Great Expectations program. Alexander Hamilton was, in a sense, the first Great Expectations kid. He grew up on an island in the West Indies called Nevis, later came to America as an immigrant. His dad abandoned him at age 10. His mom died at age 12. And he started working on the island of Nevis at age 14 just to survive. And what's interesting is a hurricane came and devastated his livelihood. So just a series of misfortunate circumstances that he had to overcome each time. And the people on the island took up a collection so that he could come to America as an immigrant and urged him to get an education. He was largely self-taught. The people on the island noticed him because he had written poems about his experience with the hurricane, and they became famous. And so they took up that collection. Education saved him. He was an avid reader, largely self-taught, and then he came to America and wanted to go to Princeton, but he wanted to go in an accelerated fashion. He wanted to do in 2 years what usually took 4 years or 3 years to do, and because of the Revolutionary War, and they told him, no, you can't do that. So instead, he ended up at King's College, but his education was interrupted by the war, and then later finished his degree and became a lawyer. Came out of the most abject of poverty circumstances, unbelievable. And what did he do? He ended up creating the U.S. monetary system. He founded the Bank of New York, created the U.S. Coast Guard, established the New York Post, wrote most of the Federalist Papers that defended the Constitution, and without the Federalist Papers, the Constitution probably wouldn't have been accepted, and was largely credited with creating the Electoral College as well. Just a number, he's responsible for the fact that the U.S. Capitol is in Washington, D.C., and that was a compromise position that he took because he really wanted the power of that monetary system that he was so studied so much about and willed into existence. So fascinating story. In very many ways, it's a story that many of our students go through, where they overcome tremendous obstacles to get an education, and it's the education that saves them and helps them make a better life for themselves.
Thank you, John.
Yep.
So, Ted, playing off of John's comments, he's pulled out some nuggets from that book, and there may be others too. What did you see in your evaluation of the reading material you had that folks in this room may have also read? Maybe it's been a while. What are the nuggets? What are the takeaways from your experience?
Well, one nugget, Craig, is never judge a book by its cover.
Profound.
We can think that John's book is bigger, but when you get about halfway through, it's all pictures.
Just a couple pages.
3 nuggets that were loud and clear. First of all, I think clearly that leadership skills are transferable, whether you're transferring them up into an organization or you're transferring them across organization. I was reminded, as we all are, particularly leaders in a classroom or wherever else, leaders are role models. And even though you think they're hanging on your every word, they're watching your every step. And Lee recognized that across all of the venues where he served. The other thing is good leaders build on prior experiences. So you're not just born a good leader and then you're naturally a good leader at everything that you do. You work at it and you build upon those experiences. And then I'd say, if I could add a fourth one, and this comes from when he was in a war. I think our immediate past U.S. president wrote a book about hope dies last. A leader must keep hope alive, even when facing extreme adversity, quote from him in the book. So I don't know, I think about extreme adversity in the Civil War out there on the front line is maybe a little bit different than when I look at what we're struggling with in the community colleges, not just in Virginia, but across the country with with our leaky pipes and our students that we want more of, and we're getting more and more, and they're harder and harder to serve, and all of those things. But as a leader, and I'm not just talking about your president, I'm talking about you as a leader in your organization. You're the one that has to keep that beacon of hope alive as you work every day in what you do, right? We're moving the mark, and and it's gonna continue another 50 years. And so I think that's probably the most salient nugget that I'm focused on.
Thanks, Ted. And good point to bring to this group. It's not just when describing leadership, and these folks that you're describing frequently are CEOs of their time, whether it's in battle or in politics or otherwise. But these lessons, it sounds like you're saying, Ted, are extractable for folks who are both aspiring to those positions, but also folks who might be somewhere in the middle. Any thoughts on middle leadership?
Let me give you another little quote
Okay.
from Robert E. Lee, or a quote about him anyway. He was a leader even when he was a subordinate. And he was happily accepting the responsibilities of those his senior. Like I happily accept the responsibilities from those my senior. But seriously, I think too often we think about leader, we think about CEO, we think about president, and we don't let ourselves think of ourselves as leaders now and take advantage of that opportunity to lead that everybody in this room has. I don't care what your role is in your organization. You have an opportunity to lead, and you should take advantage of that.
Chancellor, nuggets that you found either from Washington or from Roosevelt?
They cannot be deterred. If they're blocked one way, they'll find a different way to accomplish a goal. So, for example, Washington. Oh, and another little nugget is they'll accept some guidance if it makes sense. And I constantly seek out guidance among the people that I work closely with. I listen to them. So Washington got his butt kicked in New York City. It was almost over. It should have been over. He got his butt kicked right at where Times Square is. That's where in fact, all his men were running, and he's screaming, "Where are you going?" He used to talk about in the French and Indian War, he was very tall, unusual for the time. And he used to talk about there was a kind of a fascination listening to the bullets going through the leaves in the trees as they're shooting him, and he was kind of fascinated. But he came real close, and he led that effort. He wanted the front-on assault to take on the greatest army in the world at that time, and he got his butt kicked and barely got out of there. And then he started to listen. You're not going to win in a conventional way. You're not going to take out the greatest army. And he started listening. And he really became the first, what I call kind of guerrilla. Little skirmish here, a little skirmish here, a little victory here, and then a couple of big ones. And eventually won. And he didn't even know he won at Yorktown. You don't know. It's not over till it's really over. And that actually came a year later. It could have been a little bit longer than that. So they're willing to take guidance. They'll stay focused on the prize. And sometimes I think, leaders on the deficit side, is sometimes we probably should take guidance a little sooner because we do make mistakes. Hopefully we learn from those mistakes.
Thank you. John, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to turn now towards sort of what do you draw from Hamilton that's extendable to the present or the future? Hamilton's much in the news recently. You mentioned, Broadway. There's a resurgence in interest in his life. What's extractable? What brings us to modernity?
Well, particularly on leadership, I think his life represents that there's a lot of paradox in leadership, that leadership isn't just straightforward. And what I mean by that is he was a very stubborn and unyielding man, especially early in his life. But his overriding characteristic, his overriding value was that he had an unbelievable passion for what he did believe in, to the point of being obnoxious. But Washington taught him you need to compromise sometimes. You need to yield on values that are less important in order to obtain values that are more important. And so I think there's a certain paradox in that we all talk about our mission and our vision and our values and things, and there's no compromising on those. But I do think that implementing those takes a leader who is passionate about their beliefs but understands when to push the certain buttons that make them easier to implement. Another paradox is there's something about the story of all the Founding Fathers that balances personal ambition with a greater cause. Yeah. They were all flawed men and women, and their personal ambition sometimes, often maybe even got in the way of them accomplishing even greater things. But it was those characteristics about them, that their weaknesses, that made them even greater than perhaps they would have been otherwise. And then, kind of related, profound and foolish mistakes in their lives were just sort of ironic given where they ended up and what they did for the country. So in Hamilton's case, he had an affair that Jefferson accused him of stealing money from the Treasury. In order to defend himself on that charge, he revealed his own affair in a newspaper article, in a pamphlet that he distributed all over the place. Absolutely ruined his career, but for him, it helped him defend his honor that he wouldn't steal. So just kind of the ironies of the Founding Fathers. Their greatest strengths were often their greatest weaknesses, and I think leaders in general need to remember that. Our greatest weaknesses are also our greatest strengths, and vice versa.
Good observations, John. You, in working with Lee, you drew someone who is on the wrong side of history in many ways, but not still without lessons that are probably extractable to the present. What do you see in Lee that you think is both valuable today and perhaps valuable then?
I think it gets beyond defeat does not mean defeated. But I can't get over the transferability of his leadership skills and style. And I think when I think about leadership, leadership is kind of like management, right? In the sense that it's about people. And people are complex. No matter what context you're in, the people piece is very complex. And I think when I think about leadership, when Lee thought about leadership, it wasn't just about setting out a vision, right? We're going to go here, or we're going to be this, and then simply guiding the behavior of others to that vision. I think one thing that I learned is, more importantly than that, leadership includes getting those others to think differently. Not just follow for a paycheck or for a pat on the back or for so they don't lose their job, etc. It's about getting people to think differently, which he was masterful at. And it's not just different about situations, but thinking differently about institutions, thinking differently about initiatives, and probably most importantly, thinking differently about strategy.
So, Craig, if I can, there's an important point here that I think these great leaders know that they have to work with others to get something done. So, if you believe in the story that there is this God, and he made this whole universe in 6 days and rested on the seventh, I can tell you the only way that God did that, he didn't have to work with anybody. These folks had to work with a lot of people.
There's the intermission humor, right?
and often, here's something else. Often, their passion and their goals are at the time unconventional. What he did, the fights that he had to get involved to create this monetary system, and very, very controversial. And the biggest controversy was right here in Virginia because Virginia paid all of its war debts. Massachusetts didn't pay a nickel, and other states. And so Virginia says, heck no, we're not going to buy into that. And he was a deal maker. He said, well, how about we do a couple of things? I'm about ready to call for the abolishment of slavery. Oh, don't do that. He goes, well, I'll put it off for 40 years, or maybe longer, and I'll throw in Virginia, you can have the capital. But we need a monetary system. He was a deal maker. I mean, he knew how to work with others. He knew how to work with others. But.
So, gentlemen, I'm hearing themes like a lack of perfection exists in leaders. Or maybe another way of saying it is leaders need not be perfect. And as John pointed out, in many cases, those imperfections can be their strengths in moderation. I'm hearing things that being unyielding in vision is important, but compromise in process, or in those things that are perhaps not critical to vision. Let's move it to right now. Let's move it to our work. John, I'll toss it to you, but don't feel like you need to speak first. What does the book teach us, your book, teach us about our current work? What lessons can be drawn for community colleges in the 21st century?
Well, I like to think about the Hamiltons we may be producing. I don't think we think enough about that. The importance of education as a means to an unbelievable end for the future of our country and our world. Who knows who's in our classes? And the brilliant minds we come across that work hard every day overcoming tremendous obstacles. So I think that's an overriding lesson. I think the role of mentorship, if Hamilton didn't have Washington, if Hamilton didn't have his wife Eliza, he would have been nothing in a lot of ways. It was them who toned him down and smoothed over his rough edges that helped him become a great leader, I think. And then the role of mission and vision, I think, can't be overstated, that you do have to believe in something, and you do have to sort of persuade other people of your cause. But no leader does that persuasion alone. I think we sometimes think Washington persuaded everybody. There were unbelievable fights in his cabinet between Jefferson and Hamilton. And Washington was beside himself, didn't know what to do. But in the election of 1800, when Jefferson and Burr tied in the Electoral College, everybody thought that Hamilton would choose Burr because he hated Jefferson so much. But what he said was that Jefferson has principles that he believes in. Burr was a type of guy who was expedient, who just wanted to have power for its own sake, and Hamilton knew that. So he voted for Jefferson over Hamilton, and that's what ultimately did him in, because then the duel happened, and that was really what the duel was about, that Jefferson sort of, in Burr's mind, betrayed him from becoming the president. So I think all those things teach us lessons about today, and especially that when you're in a leadership position, don't forget all the leaders around you, that it really isn't about position or title. It's about what does this person in this unique spot in the organization do for that whole organization. Jefferson had a different role than Hamilton, who had a different role than other founding fathers, than Monroe. So I think that's a very important lesson to reflect on.
Thanks, John. Ted, from your work with Robert E. Lee, what do you see there that's extractable and bring to our work at community colleges?
I think first and foremost, this certainly just isn't just Robert E. Lee, and that is mission focus. And I don't think any of us have to be told or to buy into this mission that we have of open enrollment, of all the things that we do in a community. I think we get it. I don't know if everything that we do is always with that first and foremost in mind. And so whether it's big things we're doing and now with student success and focusing on not just bringing more in, but also helping them as they get through. I think that on John's point, and I think it's the same thing in the 19th century and even today, and that is, don't forget about the leaders that are around you, whether they're in your organization or in a different organization, whether they're in a community college or in a community, that not only believe in what we're doing, but expect us to be doing those things and expect us to be taking students in an open enrollment environment and doing the best we can to get a success story for every one of them. That's what I think is important, whether you're in the Civil War or the war with the middle class that we're fighting to hold on to here. The bottom line is, let's not forget of the expectations that those around us have, and build on that strength. And then finally, I think it's back to this idea about we've got to get those that are following our leadership to think differently, whether they're students and they think about their success or their potential or lack thereof, whatever the context. I think that's what came through loud and clear here.
There's another common ingredient, and this is, I think, something that faculty should think about. All of these great leaders are also, or were, great teachers. Just look at what they wrote. These are lectures. I mean, the Federalist Papers. Look at Washington's farewell speech. Look at what they wrote. They seized a teachable moment. One time I was touring West Point many years ago, and we met with the provost there. And he said, I don't know if it's still a West Point or Army practice, but he said, we believe that in the Army, you have to prove to really advance in your career, you have to prove yourself as an effective teacher. And they used to cycle back their emerging leaders back into the classroom to be teachers. Because, I mean, if you think about it, leaders are great teachers. Right in the classroom, your classroom, and what you do is you take who's this foster care kid who's kind of wacky, and you inspire that life to do something way beyond what that life was thinking about. That's what I think great teachers do. And I can prove it to you. If I ask you, name me one or two of your best teachers in your life. Go back to elementary school, high school, or college, doesn't matter. And I say, well, you see that person? You know the name. If I said, why did you pick that person? You're not going to tell me, well, it really taught me how to do algebra or understand Freud or speak Spanish. You won't say that. You're going to say, I picked that person because that person altered my life in some fundamental positive way. If it weren't for that person, I probably wouldn't be doing A, B, and C. So great leaders, at least my observation, are great teachers. And the inverse of that, I think, is true too. Great teachers, you in the room, become great leaders. For the same reason you're good in the classroom. You have a cause much beyond yourself. You're motivated to help others. I mean, great teachers come to need their students more than their students need them. That's how you tease out meaning in life. You kind of get itchy. You kind of miss it when you're away from it. And your passion is not the discipline that you're teaching. Your passion is this life that's sitting in front of you. And another thing that I've noticed, like these people we're talking about in these books, the great teachers that we have had, they achieve a sense of immortality, that of remembrance. We do not forget them. We do not forget them. Now, history has written about these, but you haven't forgot about those great ones that I asked you to think about. In fact, many of you have somehow resurrected them in your own teaching. You kind of act like them. Well, this one would have done that, so I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do that too. So, great teachers become great leaders. Great leaders are great teachers.
Chancellor, one of the things that reminds me of is I think great teachers are often not the ones you like the best. And I think back to your question, and they're the ones that challenge you, maybe give you more work than you want at the time. And I think of all of us like to take shortcuts and get the fastest degree, but it's the teachers we remember are the ones that said, you ought to be doing this, you could do this, and inspire you to work harder. And that's one of the lessons of Alexander Hamilton. He was not universally loved. I think it's hard for many leaders to be in a position where their decisions are not universally loved.
Really?
Not at all. And I think that's a lesson in leadership that can often be overlooked, because all of us want to be liked, all of us want to be loved, but you can't be motivated by that primarily. You got to be motivated by that desire to teach, that desire to do something better for the whole organization than for any one individual, and that's challenging at times.
My best teacher in my life, I handed in a paper, and it was, I did it in pencil, I did it on the run, and I handed it in, and I got it back a week later, and it had one word on it: crap. With an arrow, like turn it over. And I turned it over and it had 2 words: see me. And he went up one side of me and down the other side of me, and he was a great teacher.
You didn't like him that day.
That day, I mean, I deserved what I got. But, you know, it used to get me mad when my kids would bring home a paper from school, and it would have a perfect score on it, and not one comment, and I can immediately see 5 major errors or grammatical problems. I'm thinking, you're ripping my kid off. So I think good teachers, great teachers, become ego involved with their students. I mean, if you see crap, call it out. If you see that someone can do better, call it out. You see someone is really, you know, it's kind of interesting, the sales software that many of you use, preliminary research indicates that the kudos are more inspirational than the flags. When you think about it, our students typically are coming to us from difficult lives and not a lot of success. They get a flag, yeah, well, I could have told you you're going to flag me. They get a kudo, wow, I actually did something that was noticeable, so it works.
Let's turn to the great teachers, both past, present, and future in this audience, and hear some questions for this panel on the books they've read or on leadership in general. I'd like to have some, I think we have some microphones available for folks who have questions. Is there a question from the audience?
Oh, hold on, please.
Now I have the microphone, I can ask a question. Any of the leaders you've read about all existed before the age of mass media, all existed before the age of social media, before Facebook, before Twitter, etc. How would they have fared today? Could they have done the great things they did in a world where you're criticized early, often, frequently, and violently? How would that have changed the dynamic on perhaps their lives?
It's such an interesting question, because Jefferson and Hamilton and a lot of the founding fathers were absolutely vitriolic to each other in the press. So they used the newspaper, made up lies, made up stories to try to disparage the other side and get people to join their side.
And not put their own name on it.
And not put, yeah, they did it anonymously.
Some pseudo-writer do it.
Yeah. And really, the Federalist Papers, same way. It was an argument they were making to the people of New York at the time, or you know, I often think of sort of the Twitter wars, especially this past election, and how vitriolic it was and continues to be in many ways. And I don't know, in a strange sense, get some comfort that the founding fathers were like that too. That maybe there is some leader out there that's going to kind of bring us all together and realize, you know, that there's a better way to do things than by cutting each other down. But I think, for me, it's striking that it wasn't so different, just because it was just a different medium. They didn't use Twitter and they didn't use social media, but boy, did they use the newspaper.
There was a lot of fake news back then.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
There was.
Yes.
During Lincoln's time, most of the major publications had a clear political bent to them, and it was they were propaganda machines. But you know, but Lincoln's people used it to their advantage too. You know, but John's right. I mean, not much has really changed. technology has changed. I guess the reach, Jeff, has really changed. I mean, Trump can get to 100 million people with, you know, with 120 characters or whatever the tweet is.
And I think from a community college viewpoint, it makes jobs as teachers even that much harder to teach students how to analyze news. I mean, one of my best teachers in high school said to me, "You've got to be able to argue both sides of the same issue," and would make us do two speeches, one on one side of an argument and one on the other side. I think that's not done that much today, and I think that helped me realize how some arguments are flawed in both sides of an equation, and I think that's one of the most important jobs of teachers today, is saying, don't believe everything you read, and what evidence is there that they're saying that, and it doesn't matter what publication it's in, you know, make sure you're trust but verify.
Yeah.
You know, we're really a product of Thomas Jefferson's vision. Of, you know, unfortunately, it took a couple of centuries to implement it. It's called the VCCS. But Thomas Jefferson would say, you know, democracy really depends upon an educated citizenry. I mean, it really does. If you just look at history and look at those countries that are very uneducated, democracy won't work. I mean, they need a benevolent king just to get the basic needs met. But our country, when you look at the world history, we're still an experiment. We haven't been around that long, and I think our future is going to depend upon the educational attainment of our entire society.
Friends, I would welcome more questions, but we have officially run out of time. They're turning the internet off all over the world.
I was just going to sing the music.
Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Yeah, this is the companion, this is the text.
Return to this room throughout the conference to find leadership sessions taking place. Also be sure to visit the Follett section of the conference to pick up the books referenced today, some of which I believe were even out of print, and they actually created these books just for your enjoyment. So thanks very much for coming today.
I appreciate doing this with you guys.
That was
fun.
great, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
It was good. Yeah, good.
Good job, bud. Thank you.
Very good.